There's moments where I'll watch the sunrise over the horizon and I'm steaming full ahead to my fishing grounds. And as many times I see a sunrise on the lake, it never gets old. It never gets old. So it's just kind of like watching that over and over. And I'm like, yeah, I like what I do.
The life of a tribal fisherman on Lake Superior is not always easy, but it comes with its perks. These fishermen are exercising rights guaranteed to them in treaties signed with the government more than a century and a half ago. And it brings with it a unique connection and a unique understanding of Lake Superior. You're listening to Beyond the Shore from Michigan Public. I'm Rebecca Williams. This is the fourth of 5 stories about the Great Lakes. 1 story per lake. A snapshot that tells a story about each one of the lakes, a sort of microcosm of what makes each lake unique. Chapter 4, Lake Superior. Its ancient origins and the people who stay connected to its waters through tradition. For this episode, I'm handing things over to Michigan Public's Dustin Dwyer.
Okay, so not to be too dramatic about it, but the story literally begins more than 1 billion years ago with an event of unimaginable violence. The earth cracked open, magma welling up to the surface.
And it's erupting just oceans of magma onto the surface of the earth.
And the earth, first, this is Erica Vai. She's a professor at Michigan Technological University in Houghton. She's met me and our digital director, Jody Westrick, at the A.E. Seaman Mineral Museum there, which has this beautiful collection that shows the amazing geologic history of the Keweenaw Peninsula, that unique craggy arm of land that reaches out into the middle of Lake Superior. Erica's a geologist. More specifically, she studies something called geoheritage, the connection between geology and human societies. Anyway, this event she's talking about, 1.1 billion years ago, an ocean of magma pouring out. And the Earth, it's splitting apart here, trying to create a new ocean in the middle of the continent. But for some reason, it doesn't split all the way. It stops. Then, over the course of thousands of years, the magma cools, and as it does so, it's sagging under its own weight.
So that's essentially the birth of Lake Superior, that having that basin shape.
Over the billion years, it could have filled in with sediment. But instead there was this massive sheet of ice you've probably heard about, nearly 2 miles high, Erica says. About 10,000 years ago, it started to melt.
And as that's melting or retreating, it's filling in that basin that was created 1.1 billion years ago.
Not the ocean it could have been, but it left behind one of the largest freshwater lakes on the planet. And here on the Keweenaw Peninsula, it left something else behind too.
Enter the story of the copper.
Erica says back when all that magma was flowing, it took a long time to cool, like thousands of years. And as it did, gases would pour out from deeper in the earth, creating bubbles and cracks, and also bringing up copper.
These hydrothermal fluids that are being brought up from the deep earth, carrying this gift of copper, and they're going to find any crack and crevice they can find to hide. And so those flow tops, where you've got those little air bubbles that are frozen in time, are a great place for copper to fill in.
The lake and the copper, they share a history, even today. Because once humans came along, the copper didn't stay in the ground. For thousands of years, people have collected it and mined it in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And starting 150 years ago or so, they started taking a lot more of it. And the leftovers of that massive mining effort have become a part of Lake Superior's story now.
This will hang out over the side so you're not pulling the nets up right next to the boat. And then that hand goes in there, that'll span the gap. And then this grabs it and pulls the net in.
Chris Peterson is showing me the machine that hauls up the fishing nets on his 50-foot commercial fishing boat, the Three Suns.
The first time I ever ran this boat, it was 100% different than being a deckhand. And I eventually grew to like it.
Chris took it over from his father decades ago. Chris's family moved to the Keweenaw Peninsula from Wisconsin. He's a member of the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Fishing is a tradition and a right guaranteed to Great Lakes tribes in treaties signed with the federal government. Those treaty rights haven't always been respected, but tribal fishermen fought to reassert them. Chris's own family has filed lawsuits to protect their right to fish, not just in Wisconsin, but throughout Lake Superior. He stands at the wheel, chugging out to his fishing nets in Lake Superior in early March. He says he didn't always want to be a fisherman.
No. I was going to college and, I was going to do something else. But when I was in college, I went to junior college in Escanaba, Michigan, at Bay College, and I would be looking out the window during classes, wondering how the weather was or how the fishing was going. And so I kind of came back to it.
It's not what he thought he wanted, but it turned out to be a calling.
I'm good at it now. Made a lot of money doing it, so put my two daughters through school, so I'm good at it. You got to get it in your blood. You got to fall in love with doing it, hunting fish.
When Chris spots the buoy marking his next net, he steps down from the captain's bench and stands at the side of the boat where there's a second wheel and an open panel next to the rotating wheel that pulls the net through. The deck of the boat is enclosed. Heaters are blasting to keep it warm inside. It smells of fish guts, marine grease, and Chris's Marlboros. Chris reaches out for his buoy and gets the net started into the machine. The net spills out onto a white table where 4 men stand, one guiding the net at one end, one stuffing it into a bin at the other end, and 2 in the middle, pulling the fish free from the net and chucking them into a plastic box on the floor. It's slow at first. Only a few fish appear at a time. It's a mixture of trout and whitefish.
So, we had something, but not what I'm looking for. I need bigger numbers than that. At least a box of whitefish would be nice.
Chris tells me he put his lines out a little shallower than he usually would. He wasn't sure how many fish he'd get. He has his favorite spots already picked out. He's one of the few large boat commercial fishermen on the lake. So he sees it more. As a tribal fisherman, he sees what comes up in the nets and what doesn't. And a couple decades ago, his uncle and his dad fished these waters a little closer to shore, in shallower water where there's an underwater pile of rocks known as Buffalo Reef. It had always been a good fishing spot for them, until it seemed it wasn't. Chris says his uncle mentioned it to some people at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, Gliffwick.
We had told whoever at Gliffwick that they weren't catching no fish. I don't know if he said because of stamp sands or not, but he said something's up with Buffalo Reef. And eventually I ended up finding out that all that tailings was drifting off of there, blowing off of there, and covering up that reef.
Scientists began studying the reef, and what they found underwater on the rocks traced back to the shore, to the history 1.1 billion years ago, to the copper. The reason the fish weren't on the reef was because of the leftovers from 2 copper mines that operated a century ago near the shore here. The mines operated by pulling chunks of rock out of the ground and smashing them into bits. The copper bits were separated out, but there was lots of coarse leftover so-called stamp sands or tailings that had trace amounts of copper. The mine operators just dumped it all on the beach, 23 million metric tons of it. Over time, the copper-infused sands drifted onto the reef. The Environmental Protection Agency says copper can be toxic to fish in higher concentrations, and the scientists who studied Buffalo Reef found fish had started to avoid spawning there. The copper history is evident everywhere you go in the Keweenaw Peninsula. This area has the largest deposit of what's known as native copper anywhere in the world. The copper taken from here is the same copper used in the wires that brought electricity to every home in America a century ago. And people up here are still dealing with the leftovers. Chris Peterson steers the 3 sons back to the icy dock with several boxes of fish. It's not as many as he'd hoped for, but enough to restock the fish market. Waiting for us on the dock is Bob Kauppi. He lives here and owns the dock. You grew up around here?
Yeah.
Do you remember the sands always being there?
There were a lot more sand when I was a kid. Yeah. The reason this dock is here is because in 1915 there was so much sand pumped in a lake that they had to harbor in the mouth of the Tobacco River, and my grandpa couldn't put his boat in it no more, so they came down here and started building their own dock, their own harbor. And the sand was out 1.1 miles out in the lake when they closed the mill in 1932. It was a big deal.
The old smokestack from the mine still pokes above the trees just down the beach. Snow covers the sands while we're there. But for nearly a century, storms have swept the sands down the beach, under the waves, on top of Buffalo Reef.
They call that the dead zone because when a fry is born on the reef, they head to the shallow water, but there's no food for them there. They have to go to past the Travers to get food. So that's why that's a big deal, that spawning grounds.
They have to go past the Traverse River farther south. If left alone, scientists say the sands will continue to drift over the reef, covering even more of it. The fish like rocky places like Buffalo Reef for spawning because it has all these nice secret spaces. The sands bury those perfect little spots, and the traces of copper that remain in the sand are also potentially toxic to the fish. Nearly a decade ago, the Environmental Protection Agency created a new Buffalo Reef task force to study how to stop the spread of stamp sands on the reef. Since then, there's been annual dredging, and there's a plan for how to remove much of the sand to stop its spread. The problem is that plan could cost $2 billion. So for now, the state and tribes are just doing maintenance, digging up sands from one end of the beach, trucking them to the other, away from the reef, just slowing it down enough to keep things kind of in check. A big part of that work right now and in the future is coming from the Keweenaw Bay Indian community.
I see a fishy. He's swimming. I see a fishy swimming.
Destiny Lunsfa is watching her bait fish swim through the hole in the ice. Each February, the Keweenaw Bay Indian community hosts a free ice fishing day for local families. This year, it was on the water at the head of the bay next to the Sandpoint Lighthouse. Grace Juntanen stood on the ice with her family, including Destiny, over what the fish finder said was 40 feet of water. What kind of fish are you going to catch?
Any. Actually, trout and whitefish run through this place.
Well, what's your intention, though? What do you want?
Trout.
You really want trout? Why?
Yeah, we smoke the fish that we catch.
Trout's your favorite?
Yeah.
The event is organized by the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community's Natural Resources Department. Evelyn Ravindran is the director. She's standing on the ice wearing a blue coat and sunglasses. She'd walked around greeting people, fishing through the ice. Evelyn's other name, she tells me, is Laughing Water Woman.
That was the name that was gifted to me many years ago. I'm with Bear Clan, and my name really reflects my ties to Lake Superior and to the waters of this area, that there's a joy, and this is home to me, and I need this as a touchstone every day of my life. You know, that it's very important to me what happens, and I stay connected to these waters.
Whether it's on the ice or standing on the beach as the waves roll in or swimming, she says she tries to connect with this water every single day.
It's a balance, a connectedness to the water and to the beings that are here that share the same landscape as us. It's important for me to know what's happening and that I'm interacting in a good way, and that I'm sharing this with my community, and I'm hearing what they say then too, and they're sharing with me on their feelings about things that are happening out here. I think that was the most important thing, that we always keep this connection very strong.
She says she's always felt that connection herself, and it's what drew her to the work in the Natural Resources Department. She started out managing a tiny fish hatchery more than 20 years ago. Now she manages a full staff, and she sits on the Buffalo Reef Task Force. The task force has recommended creating a landfill inland to deposit the stamp sands from the shore, and building a jetty to block the flow of what remains.
Some of the things that have to be looked at take years, and I know like the process of Buffalo Reef, if you look at the timeline of it, like are coming to know what was happening there and getting a group together and working on, we're talking decades. But as has been expressed in those meetings and with the community around here, we're not going anywhere. And whether it takes 100 years, we're still here, we're still working on it, it's still an obligation, it's still something that's important to us and that we have to keep on working on.
That word, obligation, is a big word when it comes to the tribe's work and connection to this lake. There are the obligations that come from the tribe's treaties with the U.S. government. The 1842 treaty, which is the one signed by the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, is often called the Mineral Treaty, Evelyn tells me. The U.S. government had already signed a treaty in 1836 for tribes in the eastern UP. But in 1841, state geologist Douglas Houghton published a survey describing in detail the apparent copper formations in the Keweenaw Peninsula. The next year, the U.S. government entered into a treaty that covered the peninsula. That treaty gave the U.S. the right to mine the copper. It also gave tribal members the right to continue fishing, which is what Chris Peterson's uncle and dad were doing when they discovered that fish were avoiding Buffalo Reef. For Evelyn, that points to the other obligations. Obligations not in the 1842 treaty or the 1836 treaty, but in what the tribe considers the first treaty, the treaty with the Creator. Out on Keweenaw Bay, the ice fishing wraps up. Evelyn leads me back to the snowy shore where kids are eating hot dogs and adults are sitting around the fire. Evelyn tells me events like this one are important to introduce more kids to fishing, to teach them the traditions and obligations of that first treaty.
One of the things with our youth groups that it was beautiful to hear was that somebody brought up about, what about the fish? Like, what do they want? And I really felt like they heard that we're sharing this landscape with other beings, and they have a right for decisions too.
We reach the shore where folks are still gathering around, kids climbing snow piles up to tree branches, adults starting to clean up. And we find Evelyn's brother, Paul Smith. He's the owner of First Catch LLC, another commercial fishing operation. Evelyn says she doesn't go out on Paul's boats as much as she did when they were younger. And there was one time when they were out on a boat together when the wind picked up and the motor cut off. And as Paul tried to fix the motor, it slipped off the back of the boat into the water. And they ended up having to row in.
And there's always, it seems like there's a story that's associated when her and I get on the same vessel. And
I say the same thing.
Though Paul grew up fishing, he says he didn't always think he was going to be a fisherman. But the water kept drawing him back.
There's moments where I'll watch the sunrise over the horizon and I'm steaming full ahead to my fishing grounds. And as many times I see a sunrise on the lake, it never gets old. It never gets old. So it's just kind of like watching that over and over. And I'm like, yeah, I like what I do.
He makes money at it, but he doesn't see it as completely different from the work his sister does in conservation with the Natural Resources Department.
So as it being like it's kind of taking, no, I mean, it's more for me like stewardship. And I think that stewardship played into noticing problems such as what's happening in the Buffalo Reef area, or biologists and scientists will say one thing, but when you're watching it happen with your harvest, you're like, well.
The tribal fishermen just see the lake differently. For now, Paul, his sister, and even Chris Peterson, they all agree on one thing. To them, Lake Superior is the healthiest of the Great Lakes. Lake Superior is different. The people who know it best say you can feel that difference. Over by the fire, I find Kathleen Smith.
Bonjour. Wasa no de Queen is in the cause. My Ingen Hindo Dem. Nishinabe, Mede Queen, Dawekwe Dung, and Dunjaba. So my name is Kathleen Smith. I'm here as a community member today since I'm enrolled here at Keweenaw Bay Indian Community in this beautiful space. But my profession, I work for Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. My position there is Ganawangdum Manoman, she who takes care of the wild rice.
Kathleen tells me she's a water walker, which means she's part of a tradition to honor and protect the waters of the Great Lakes. She takes part in ceremonies where she carries the water over the land, walking it for many miles.
We walk from the Natural Resources Department, where they're located out there in Pequaming at First Sand, and we walk 17 miles, and we end here at the lighthouse. So I'm also a water walker. So our women in our culture, in the Anishinaabe, Kwe, we are the caretakers for the water.
The water from the lake is carried in a vessel made out of copper. And she tells me about the water walk movement, and a woman she calls Grandmother Josephine Mondamin, who said that when she walked with Lake Erie water, it felt heavier because of the pollution affecting that lake.
Yes.
What do you feel, describe it to me, when you're doing a water walk, how do you feel Lake Superior water? How does that feel different for you?
When I sing and pray for that water and as I carry that copper vessel, my feet actually become lighter, and I just want to race to the end.
It feels different with carrying Lake Superior water than other water.
It feels so different, in this community. I'm really partial to Keweenaw Bay, because it's a bigger part of Lake Superior, but that's the difference, is that it's so much lighter.
I asked Kathleen, with her tribal connection to this water, what she knows that the rest of us, especially non-tribal people, may not know.
So water is very healing. Very healing. When you sit right next to the water, it just kind of soothes you. So we've all have that. No matter what your walk of life, no matter what your belief system is, we all have that connection, to the landscape, to this beautiful Gitchigumi, to Lake Superior. And what we do with our teachings is we just remind you of your connection as well for non-tribal people. It takes a tribe to really exercise their treaty rights and to really stand for, what's ours, from since beginning of time. And to really fight for those treaty rights, we're actually also fighting for you too, for water quality standards. For our tribe is like one of the first tribes that have advocated for that. And it's how important it is, for all of us to really understand that we're here just to remind you of what you already know.
What you already know, what we already know, is that this lake is ancient, formed in the hot fire of an ocean of magma created by melting ice, carrying precious resources below its waves and on the shore. What you already know is that what we do here now affects what comes next, just as what was done before affects us now. And the people who lived here, the people who live here, have an obligation to keep that in mind.
Next time on Beyond the Shore, we go on a road trip to follow the American eel.
Eels are mysterious.
Come along for the ride as we unravel the unbelievable journey of the eel, from Lake Ontario to the open ocean, the final chapter in our series on the Great Lakes. Dustin Dwyer and Jody Westrick reported and produced this episode, with editing from me, Vincent Duffy, Kate Furby, and Jody Westrick. Special thanks to Randy Kest, Detroit PBS, and Great Lakes Now. Support for the production of this podcast was made possible by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation as part of its Great Lakes News Collaborative. Music by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Rebecca Williams. Beyond the Shore is a production of Michigan Public. You can find all of our podcasts at michiganpublic.org/podcasts.